Scenario 2 is the Russians do break the Ukrainians and they're at the Polish border this year, in which case we will get that direct NATO-Russia conflict that we've been desperately trying to avoid this whole time. Because from the Russian point of view, capturing all of Ukraine does not solve their security problem. They actually have to plug the access points that allow access to the Eurasian landmass, and that means getting to Warsaw. And that means a direct fight with NATO.
And is that the nightmare scenario?
Yeah, because that means there will be nukes used. The Russians have proved repeatedly that they can't find a conventional war against NATO equipment in the traditional sense. And if we get them attacking NATO and you get the full force of NATO and the American military complete with total air superiority, it'll obliterate the conventional columns. And the only thing that the Russians will have left to throw are nukes, and they will throw them.
So that's scenario 2.
That's scenario 2. Scenario 3, the Ukrainians are able to do a lightning assault south, probably from Zaporizhzhia to the Sea of Azov, and in doing so, completely cut off the entirety of the Crimea. Crimea relies on irrigation from a single canal for 80% of their food production, and the sluice gate is now in Ukrainian control, so it will not be turned on. And with the Kerch Strait Bridge offline, the Russians can't rail food into Crimea, and the rest of the Kerch Bridge, the road bridge, is undoubtedly going to go down later this year. So there you put the bulk of the best troops that the Russians have on a starvation diet, literally, and you probably have 500,000 people dying from famine in the Crimea, including the best of the Russian military units this year. I don't think even in the best case scenario that the Ukrainians can kick the Russians out of the eastern parts of Ukraine this year, because they don't have sufficient deep strike into Russia proper to break up the logistics lines. And that is what is necessary. If Ukraine is going to win, they don't just need to clear their own territory. They need to clear the ability of the Russians to invade in the first place. And that means striking deep, at least 300 kilometers over the border. I was raised metric, so it's weird living in the United States and thinking metric. So anyway, we're not ready for that fight, but that fight is not this year.
Right.
If you don't want to get nuked, you need to give Ukraine absolutely everything they can get as soon as they possibly can. Western troops can't be on the ground. That would trigger a nuclear exchange in no time. But the pace of training needs to expand by at least an order of magnitude, and that means we need to double, probably quadruple, the rate of arms manufacture across the NATO alliance as soon as possible. Once you look at the cost of the materials that go in, is the lowest in the world in terms of efficiency per hectare. This is a country that is basically Enron in nation-state form in terms of its finance, and its leader has completely decapitated the decision-making process of every province and every bureau in the entire system. It is waiting to fall. On top of that, it is dying. They're now admitting that they overcounted their population by over 100 million people since one child, suggesting that all of the missing millions are age 40 or under, childbearing. And even before that, they already had the fastest aging workforce in human history. China will cease to exist as a functional, economically viable population by the end of this decade. So I expect Chinese disintegration over the next decade. And then the decade after that, if we're lucky, it will not devolve into a civil war, but that's a very reasonable possibility. But a severe breakup and a severe population correction, if you want to use a sterile term for 500 million people dying of famine, is kind of baked in at this point. So China reverts from being a country to a geographic concept like it has been for most of its history. India won't have an energy crisis. It's the first stop out of the Persian Gulf. It might have a food crisis, but they have fertilizer fabrication in country, and they don't have the security issue for bringing in things like phosphate or potash that the Chinese have. So if it can be solved, it will be solved in India. Their security crisis is one they're familiar with Pakistan and Bangladesh. We'll never rule out that they will start duking it out again. And since nukes are part of the equation, we can't ignore that. But neither side is itching for that fight, and they actually do have decent buffers between Pakistan and India. There's a desert for most of it. So I don't think that's likely. You remove the Germans and the Chinese from global manufacturing, and North America has to double the size of its industrial plant if it still wants stuff. India has to do the same thing. Now, unlike the US and Canada, India doesn't have a partner. They don't have the equivalent of a Mexico to help out and make this an easier carry. So it's not going to be as efficient. It's not going to be as high quality, but it's going to be enough for them. And if you are producing goods for 1.5 billion people, that's a lot of economic growth. And yes, the consumer base, their demographics are not aging nearly as quickly as China's. They are aging. It is not the bottomless pit of people that people think it is. If you
think median age somewhere around 27 or 28.
Oh, I don't have that number at top of mind. But if you think of a traditional demographic structure as a pyramid with more babies than children, than young adults, than mature adults, than retirees, just a pyramid. India, the pyramid goes down to about age 35 and then drops straight down. So they are aging quickly. And that will be a problem 40 years from now.
Right.
But that's 40 years. A lot can change in 40 years. The short version is probably not. I mean, Africa is a big place, 50 odd countries.
Sure.
The story I'm about to tell you doesn't match for all of them, but for most of them. So the African demographic profile has happened because of two things. Number one, the world is sufficiently globalized and China has been sufficiently hungry that they will pay anything for raw materials, that all of Africa, not just sub-Saharan Africa, has been able to export raw commodities that are industrial and import food. And that has allowed the populations to expand significantly. So Egypt today, if all of a sudden food imports were no longer an option, they would lose half their population. Even if they converted all their citrus and all of their cotton to wheat, they now have twice the population that's necessary, or twice double the population that their land could support if they just switched over to wheat. And no one in Africa is that extreme, but they're all kind of flavors of that trend. Number two, part of the reason that countries, as they industrialize for the early decades, actually get a much larger population is child mortality goes down significantly. In the case of Africa, that's not because they have gotten better at it. That's because they've been able to afford the technologies that they import in terms of things like antibiotics and childcare stuff. In a post-globalized environment, the food imports and those technologies go away. And you would expect to see population crashes, maybe not as dramatic as what I'm expecting to see in China, but still horrific. The second problem is that Africa is a series of 5 stacked plateaus, and it's very difficult to get physical infrastructure up and down those plateaus. So in the colonial era, the Europeans never tried. They built tap lines to go to a specific economic resource, typically a mine, and that was it. And the Africans have discovered that the cost of building a real transport network is just too onerous and the benefits from it are too thin. So it just really hasn't happened at scale outside of South Africa. That makes it very hard for them to benefit in a post-globalized system. They'll still have those tap lines. They'll still have the resources that the world needs. And I don't think we're going to have a
raw commodities, though.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to have a new colonial era because, just because they're going to see higher expenses and higher death rates doesn't mean that all of a sudden all the guns are going to go away. I mean, part of the reasons why the colonial era was so horrible for the Africans is the Europeans brought guns to knife fights for decades. Well, Africans' guns might not be as good as European guns, but they're still guns. And so that the delta isn't there anymore. But that doesn't mean I think they're going to do great. So there's pockets. The birth rates, the survivability of the youth in Africa, in the HIV countries, has basically dropped by more than half. And yes, they are now getting better at prevention, but that takes a massive melon scoop out of their demographic structure that is irreplaceable. So the United States and Canada are two of the world's greatest agricultural producers and massive exporters. Check. That's not going anywhere. The North American system can provide for its own input system for agriculture, so it's not going to go anywhere at all. Canada and the United States are two of the world's largest energy producers and processors. That's not going anywhere. So already the basics of civilization look pretty good. We've got ocean moats. We don't have to worry about an invasion. Check. Our demographics. The United States is the healthiest demography in the advanced industrial world. Mexico is the healthiest demography in its peer class. And Canada has the best record in the world, bar none, for attracting people in their 20s and 30s via immigration. Those three together make North America by far the best demographic picture on the planet. So our capital structure is more or less stable. Our consumption base is fine. Our weakness is in manufacturing. Now, because of the shale revolution, the United States is very good at low-end manufacturing. Heavy chemicals, plastics, that sort of thing, because we have the cheapest inputs in the world.
Right.
We're also, because of our educational system, the best at the high end. That's where Canada competes, and not well. In the middle are the Mexicans.
Right.
Everything from heavy machinery to automotive, they excel. So the challenge moving forward is the other stuff. the stuff that we've largely farmed out to East Asia. On the low end, the materials processing, that's primarily a China story. I'm really not worried about the long-term picture.